A certain man, long dismissed as the worthless eldest son of Perdium, carried a reputation that weighed heavier than any blade. He was branded uncontrollable, a reclusive sword master who shut himself away, often whispered about as a madman. His name was Perdium. Amid the chaos, a knight clad in armor writhed in pain, struggling to comprehend the reality of his downfall. He had been defeated by none other than Ghislain, the very man he had scorned as human refuse. To the knight, it was unthinkable that he, the finest warrior of the North, had been bested by someone so reviled. Around him, the bodies of fallen comrades lay scattered, silent witnesses to the massacre. As the knight trembled, another presence emerged from the shadows. A man in gleaming armor, wielding a massive axe, stepped forward. His voice was cold, detached, as he remarked on the knight's surroundings. He spoke of the considerable expense it had cost to prepare such intricate traps, his piercing gaze drilling into the broken warrior as he asked if the setting suited him. The knight's fury burned. To think that Ghislain, the worthless bastard he had mocked, could have orchestrated this carnage was unbearable. Grinding his teeth, he demanded to know whether Ghislain had truly foreseen everything. Ghislain drew closer, his expression carved in stone, and calmly revealed that he had indeed anticipated every move. He spoke with chilling precision. He had known their numbers, uncovered their spies, even identified the source of their reinforcements. Every detail, every decision, every step, they had all fallen neatly into his hands. The knight's disbelief mounted. His voice rose in desperation as he shouted that he always carried a hidden ace. How could someone as insignificant as Ghislain have constructed such a flawless victory? Before the knight could continue, Ghislain silenced him with a sharp kick to the face. His voice was steady and commanding as he ordered him to stop talking. Removing his helmet, Ghislain declared that his goal was not merely to win this battle, but to claim victory in every war yet to come. His smile was one of absolute certainty as he asked if the knight understood why his triumph was inevitable. With confidence unshaken, Ghislain stated that he possessed all the plans necessary for conquest. The story shifted to 1 year earlier, in a soldier's camp of the Lithania kingdom near the Perdium estate. Inside a dimly lit tent, Ghislain jolted awake, shocked to find himself alive. His hand instinctively reached for his throat, as though to confirm his survival. Confusion flooded him as memories resurfaced moments ago, or so it seemed. He had faced certain death. He recalled being disarmed, his sword knocked away. Blood poured from his mouth as he fell to his knees before a knight clad in golden armor, his red hair burning like fire. This man was Aiden, one of the 7 strongest knights on the continent. Aiden's voice carried the weight of finality as he proclaimed the war finished. Pointing his blade at Ghislain, he asked if the defeated son of Perdium had any last words. Struggling for breath, Ghislain admitted with bitter regret that he had failed to fulfill his vengeance. Yet, even in defeat, he spat out a curse of defiance, wishing for Aiden's eventual downfall. Aiden only smiled, mocking his words. He ridiculed Ghislain as a delusional fool and revealed that he had not expected him to be the eldest son of the ruined Perdium household. With cruel satisfaction, he reminded Ghislain how he had abandoned his family after the death of his sister. The revelation struck Ghislain like a blade to the heart. How could Aiden, a knight from another kingdom, know such personal truths? Aiden sneered at his shock, explaining that he had hunted him relentlessly. With a sinister grin, he confessed that the fall of the Perdium family had been no accident. It was a conspiracy, a joint effort between his allies and the Deline household. The truth left Ghislain reeling. The betrayal was far greater than he had imagined. As Aiden pressed his sword closer to his throat, his expression darkened. He declared that there was no reason to share any more secrets, for Ghislain's end was already sealed. As Ghislain lay on the brink of death, he demanded that his end be accepted. Yet Ghislain, consumed with fury, swore that he would never forgive him. Unmoved by this defiance, Aiden delivered a decisive strike, severing Ghislain's head in a single blow. The scene shifted to the present. Ghislain staggered toward a barrel of water and peered into its surface, only to find his head still firmly attached to his body. Confusion gripped him. Was he hallucinating? As he studied his reflection, he noticed something even stranger. He looked far younger than he remembered. Suspicion gnawed at him. Could he have been captured and used for an experiment by mages? Determined to seek vengeance if that were true, Gislin's gaze fell upon a sword resting near the barrel. While contemplating his situation, a voice called out from outside the tent, addressing him as young master. A man entered the soldier Ricardo, loyal to the Perdium household. He urged Gislin to step outside, assuring him that he knew he was awake. Before Ricardo could react, Gislin slipped behind him and pressed the blade to his neck. Startled, Ricardo froze as Gislin warned in a cold tone that his life depended on how truthfully he answered his questions. But Ricardo, still addressing him as young master, replied calmly that Gislin was crossing the line. Taken aback by Ricardo's composure, Gislin demanded an explanation. Ricardo, with unsettling nonchalance, pushed Gislin back and remarked that he had simply worn himself out earlier by throwing a tantrum before collapsing into sleep. He reminded him of his outburst, where he had demanded command of an army to raid the orcs. Gislin, still unable to grasp what was happening, accused Ricardo of spouting nonsense. Unfazed, Ricardo began packing a bag and ordered Gislin to prepare, stating that others were waiting. Unease mounting, Gislin asked where they were headed. Without hesitation, Ricardo replied that their destination was the Perdium estate. The words struck Gislin like a thunderclap. He seized Ricardo by the arm, demanding to know if he truly meant the fallen Perdium estate. The scene shifted again. Gislin stood atop a cliff, gazing down at the estate in the distance. To his shock, it stood unscathed, exactly as it once had. His memories screamed otherwise. He had seen it burn, reduced to ashes, destroyed beyond recognition. Yet here it was, pristine and untouched. Ricardo stepped closer, asking if Gislin had been plagued by a nightmare. He cautioned that referring to the Perdium household as fallen could result in expulsion by the Count himself. Gislin, however, could not accept this reality. Convinced it must be a dream, he pinched his cheek. The sharp sting of pain shattered that illusion. Everything was real. The reflection of his youthful face and the sight of the untouched estate confirmed the truth. He had somehow returned to the past. Memories of his reckless younger self came flooding back. His bitterness and feelings of inferiority had driven him into conflict with his family, and their relentless criticism had finally forced him to flee. Years later, hardened by countless battles as a mercenary, he built a reputation and a name feared across the land. By the time he returned, ready to atone for his mistakes, the Perdium household had already been reduced to ruins. Now, standing before his family's flag waving proudly above the camp, Gislin felt a surge of overwhelming relief. Everything he thought he had lost, his home, his family, his people, was still there. The weight of that realization drove him to laughter, uncontrollable and edged with madness, as he fought the wild urge to burst into song. But the euphoria was fleeting. Gislin recalled Ricardo's earlier words about their mission, the upcoming raid on the orcs. The memory dragged him back to a far darker moment, the disastrous raid of his past life, when almost the entire squad perished. Back then, Gislin had joined the operation seeking recognition. Reports had claimed only 3 orcs were stationed in the area, and blinded by ambition, he underestimated the threat. Lacking the skill to command but desperate to prove himself, he insisted on leading. When the squad encountered more than 20 orcs instead of 3, the result was nothing short of catastrophic. Nearly everyone was slaughtered. This time, Gislin swore he would not repeat that mistake. He would approach the monsters with caution and strategy. Though orcs were not clever, their sheer strength made them lethal. His greatest challenge, however, lay elsewhere, earning the trust of soldiers who saw him as nothing more than a useless failure. As these thoughts consumed him, a deafening crash shattered his focus. A wooden guard post was hurled through the air, smashing into the ground before him. A soldier screamed, alerting the others. The orcs had arrived. Chaos erupted instantly. Men scrambled into position, their fear betraying them. Gislin's chest tightened as dread washed over him. In his previous life, the orcs had attacked later. This time, they had come far earlier. He watched, horrified, as the beasts stormed the camp. Towering figures with crude but devastating weapons tore through the defenders with terrifying ease. Through the chaos, a voice rang out above the panic. A man clad in blue armor bellowed commands, rallying the squad to form ranks. It was Scoven, commander of the raid party. With sword in hand, he ordered the men into a defensive formation before stepping forward to confront one of the beasts himself. The orc's massive weapon swung down, its force enough to crush a man in an instant. Scoven barely managed to block with his blade, the clash reverberating through the battlefield. Yet the situation worsened by the moment. It was clear they had been ambushed, and their enemies' numbers were far beyond anything they had prepared for. As Scoven steadied himself, a soldier's voice shouted a warning. He turned just in time to see another orc looming behind him, weapon raised high. Before the blow could strike, a figure shoved him out of harm's way. Gislin stood in his place. Scoven froze in disbelief as his young master faced the beast head-on. The orc's axe descended, but Gislin reacted without hesitation. His sword slashed upward, severing its fingers in a spray of blood. Before the creature could recover, he drove another strike deep into its thigh, halting its advance. The squad watched in stunned silence as the orc shrieked and crumpled to the ground. But Gislin felt no satisfaction. His cuts were far from perfect, and the absence of mana weighed heavily on him. Frustration gnawed at his mind. If only he had returned to this moment sooner. He turned sharply to Scoven. "Give me command," he demanded. The commander blinked, taken aback. Reckless as always, but this, to ask for command of the squad, here, in the midst of battle, it was beyond anything Scoven could have expected. Straightening his stance, he refused without hesitation. Authority granted by the Lord was not something he could simply hand over. Annoyed but not surprised, Gislin reflected bitterly. Had their positions been reversed, he too would have dismissed such an outrageous demand from someone inexperienced. His thoughts were cut short as another orc barreled toward him. Scoven shouted for him to retreat, declaring him unfit to lead. Gislin ignored the order. Instead, he tightened his grip on his weapon. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he hurled his sword with all his strength. The blade sailed past Scoven's shoulder. Instinctively, the commander flinched and spun around, furious. He grabbed Gislin by the collar, ready to demand an explanation when the sound of steel meeting flesh rang out behind him. Turning, he saw the orc collapse, Gislin's sword buried deep in its skull. Scoven's eyes widened in disbelief. How did you strike with such precision?" Unmoved, Gislin's gaze remained steady. "The key to victory is morale," he replied calmly. "If soldiers let fear rule them, they're already defeated." Scoven glanced at the squad. The men trembled, their courage faltering against the orc's monstrous cries. Gislin, however, smiled with quiet confidence. "We seize momentum now," he declared. Without hesitation, he surged forward, yanking his sword free from the fallen orc's skull before leaping into the heart of the battle. Gislin landed atop another foe, driving his blade deep into its head. The soldiers gasped as he stood proudly on the creature's corpse, his voice rising in a furious shout. He taunted the orcs, daring them to face him, swearing he would cut down every last one of them. Enraged, the remaining orcs fixed their eyes on him. Unfazed, Gislin slashed open the stomachs of 2 advancing enemies and hacked the arm off a third. Blood sprayed across the battlefield as heads rolled in his wake. From a distance, Scoven stared in disbelief. Though a skilled wielder of mana himself, he knew even seasoned warriors struggled against orcs. Yet Gislin, a young man who seemed frail at a glance, carved through them with a precision that defied reason. But as the clash wore on, Scoven noticed his exhaustion creeping in. Gislin's movements became smaller, sharper, each strike carefully measured to conserve strength. Still, every blow struck the orc's weak points with near-surgical accuracy. Scoven realized then this was the fighting style of a true swordmaster, one who had mastered combat without mana, relying solely on instinct and refined technique. Even as fatigue threatened to slow him, Ghislain continued to mock his enemies, scoffing at their pride as a warrior race and declaring he hadn't even begun to fight seriously. His bravado drew all the orcs into a frenzied charge. Ricardo, watching from the ranks, was stunned. When a soldier beside him pointed out that Ghislain appeared to be fleeing, Ricardo grew alarmed and called out to Scoven. Scoven frowned, puzzled at first. Ghislain's taunts had drawn the enemy's full attention, a clever tactic, but the direction of his retreat made no sense. He was heading straight for a cliff. Then, in an instant, the commander understood. Without hesitation, he barked an order for his soldiers to form a shield wall and prepare to follow their young master. At the cliff's edge, Ghislain braced himself against the onslaught, silently trusting Scoven to see through his intentions. He knew his stamina was nearly gone, he could not hope to slay the entire horde alone. Yet he smiled faintly, assuring himself he had done enough. As if on cue, the thunder of marching soldiers drew the orcs' attention. Turning, they saw Scoven's men advancing in formation, spears leveled, shields locked. The hesitation in the monster's eyes was all Ghislain needed. Grinning, he declared the timing perfect, then hurled himself over the cliff. The moment he vanished from sight, Scoven roared his command. The soldiers pressed forward, their spears thrusting into the enemy ranks as they forced the orcs back step by step. The beasts, overwhelmed and unable to resist, were driven over the edge one after another. Their massive bodies tumbled to the rocks below, painting the ground red. The soldiers stood breathless, awestruck by the impossible victory. As silence fell over the battlefield, Scoven rushed to the cliff's edge and shouted for Ghislain. Relief flooded him when he spotted his young master clinging desperately to the rock face, his sword jammed into the stone to hold him steady. Ghislain, trembling and drenched in sweat, managed a weak smile. Scoven reached down, hand outstretched. But Ghislain's strength had left him. His grip faltered, his hand slipped, and the sword tore free. With no way to hold on, he plunged into the abyss. Scoven and his men could only watch in horror as he vanished into the darkness below. Then, silence shifted to memory. Ghislain heard a voice calling a voice he knew instantly. Elena. Images of his sister rushed through his mind, her tears after their mother's death, her gratitude for his care, and the cruel words she once hurled at him, claiming she hated him. The memories blurred together until he saw her as a child again, tugging at his hand and begging to follow him. Jolted awake by the vision, Ghislain's eyes snapped open. He found himself lying in a room, a cloth laid across his forehead. The soldiers had rescued him. Relief washed over him, but the dream lingered, strange and unsettling in his thoughts. Attempting to rise, Ghislain was struck by a wave of pain that left his body trembling from exhaustion. He remained on the bed, struggling to steady himself, when the door opened. A maid with long, white hair stepped in. Belinda. Her face lit up with relief and joy upon seeing him awake. Placing a bucket on the nearby table, she scolded him gently, reminding him that she had warned him to leave the fighting to the soldiers. To her astonishment, Ghislain suddenly rushed forward and embraced her tightly. Belinda froze, caught off guard by such uncharacteristic affection. Startled, she asked if she had done something to offend him, but he quickly reassured her. He explained that he was simply overjoyed to see her again. Since his childhood, Belinda had served not only as his maid but also as his tutor, patiently guiding him despite his often reckless and immature behavior. Yet, in his previous life, after the Perdium family fell into ruin, Belinda disappeared, and he never saw her again. Now, holding her once more filled him with a bittersweet sense of relief. Still bewildered by his strange behavior, Belinda asked why he was acting this way when they saw each other every day. Ghislain hesitated but knew he couldn't remain silent. He urged her to listen carefully and revealed that disaster was coming for their family. Confused, she pressed for clarification. With a grave expression, Ghislain confessed the truth: he had already died once and returned to life. Belinda laughed nervously, dismissing his words as exaggeration brought on by his near-death experience with the orcs. Ghislain shook his head, insisting he wasn't speaking of the recent battle. But she refused to believe him, telling him instead to focus on his recovery. Frustration welled up inside him when he realized she would not take his warning seriously. Changing the subject, Belinda asked what he would have done had he been too injured to attend the upcoming festival. The question caught Ghislain off guard. She reminded him that his younger sister, Elena, had been looking forward to the event, hoping to attend it with him. It was, Belinda stressed, the perfect chance for the siblings to heal their strained relationship. Ghislain's gaze shifted to a picture of himself with Elena, and memories stirred. The annual festival had always come at this time of year, yet in his previous life, his own bitterness and trauma had kept him from enjoying it. He asked when the festival would begin. Belinda replied that it was set for next week. The words struck him deeply, for he remembered too well. A week from now was the day his entire life had changed forever. As he sank into thought, the door opened once more. Ghislain's eyes widened in shock. It was Elena. Without hesitation, he ran to her and pulled her into a tight embrace. Both Elena and Belinda stared in stunned silence. Elena, startled by her brother's sudden display of affection, frowned and asked what he thought he was doing. Ghislain told her he had missed her dearly, but Elena shoved him away, calling his behavior creepy. Her strength surprised him. He had never realized how physically strong she was. Brushing off her clothes, Elena explained she had only come because Belinda asked her to. Narrowing her eyes, she demanded to know what kind of game he was playing and whether he thought such antics could repair their relationship. Ghislain blinked in confusion and asked what she meant. With cold precision, Elena reminded him of his cruel words from the past, how he once told her to leave him alone because she was annoying, how he had even said her very presence disgusted him. The memory struck Ghislain like a blade. In his previous life, he had never been close to Elena, and he realized with horror just how terrible a brother he had been. Overcome with guilt, he lowered his head and apologized. Belinda's eyes widened. Never before had she seen her master apologize first. Elena, however, remained skeptical. She asked if he had hit his head, pointing out that she'd heard an orc had struck him during the raid. Annoyed, Ghislain wondered why both Belinda and Elena kept mentioning the orc attack. He snapped that they were mistaken. It was he who had defeated the orcs. But as soon as the words left his mouth, a sharp pain surged through him, and his body gave way. Elena smirked and teased him, pointing out that he had, in fact, been carried back unconscious after the battle. Belinda and Elena both laughed at his expense, leaving Ghislain bewildered but oddly comforted. Their laughter, their presence, it was exactly as he remembered. Deep inside, he felt warmth swell within him. Yet with it came regret for all the wasted years and missed moments. His thoughts turned again to the festival that would take place in a week. In his past life, he had coldly rejected Elena's invitation to go together, claiming the raid had left him too shaken. This time, he vowed, things would be different. That moment marked the last time he ever saw his sister. In his previous life, Elena's mangled body had been discovered alongside her bodyguards. The memory of her lifeless form haunted Ghislain, filling him with regret for not being there when she needed him most. As the weight of these thoughts consumed him, a knock broke his brooding. 2 armored men stepped inside Jamal and Philip, Elena's bodyguards. Jamal informed Elena that they were waiting for her. Slightly annoyed, she reminded them that she had asked to be left alone. Bowing his head, Jamal apologized and explained that the servants had requested her oversight in preparing the festival supplies. This surprised Ghislain, who couldn't fathom why the maids would turn to her for such matters. Belinda, blunt as always, scoffed at his ignorance, pointing out that he spent his days idling away without concern for the estate. She revealed that Perdium was suffering from a severe labor shortage, forcing even Elena to take part in the preparations. the revelation shook Ghislain. In his former life, he had never once paid attention to the workings of the household. Elena rose, preparing to leave, when Ghislain suddenly offered to help. Both Elena and Belinda froze in disbelief. Elena, skeptical, asked if he had been struck on the head during the raid. Later, the town buzzed with activity as servants worked tirelessly for the festival. Elena's voice rang sharp as she scolded Ghislain, who had followed her despite her protests. She warned that his presence would only unsettle the workers. Ghislain countered, questioning whether this was truly how she treated someone trying to assist. Elena replied curtly, saying the best help he could offer was by staying out of their way. Her words stung, but Ghislain's mind drifted once again to the memory of finding her corpse in his past life. Her remains had been discovered in the slums, far from the festival grounds. Someone had either lured or forced her there. Determined not to let history repeat itself, he resolved to learn every corner of the castle to uncover hidden dangers. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. A soldier rushed toward them, calling him "my lord." The voice stirred old memories, and Ghislain recognized the man instantly. Fergus. Panting and drenched in sweat, the old soldier expressed his relief at finding his young master alive after hearing news of the orc attack. Irritated by the constant reminders of the raid, Ghislain dismissed the subject. Elena, however, approached Fergus with a mischievous smile, explaining that her brother had been acting oddly since waking. She asked Fergus to escort him back to his chambers. The soldier agreed without hesitation, much to Ghislain's frustration. His former reputation as a hooligan was hindering him yet again. Accepting defeat for now, Ghislain postponed his plan to investigate the castle. Instead, he requested that Fergus take him to the old training grounds. The soldier blinked in surprise and asked why. With a resolute gaze, Ghislain declared that he intended to train. Fergus complied, and together they walked to the estate's training field. To Ghislain's surprise, the grounds were immaculate, well-kept weapons gleamed, and the field itself was ready for use. It was far more refined than anything he had ever encountered as a mercenary. Fergus explained that the facility had been maintained in the hope that Ghislain might one day use it. He confessed that he had always believed the young lord's reckless ways would eventually pass. Ghislain was moved by the man's quiet faith. Placing a hand on Fergus's armor, he declared that he intended to live a long life. Dying, he said gravely, was an experience he never wished to endure again. The old soldier stiffened at his words, puzzled by the strange weight they carried. He asked why his master spoke as though he had already experienced death. Ghislain, wearing a faint smile, praised his sharp perception. He revealed that he had indeed died once before and been given another chance. Fergus scoffed, brushing it off as a jest, and insisted he had no time for such nonsense. Ghislain then instructed Fergus to leave him, explaining that he wished to begin training immediately. Reluctantly, the old soldier bowed and departed. Left alone, Ghislain stood in silence, reflecting on the mistakes of his former life, how he had treated allies as obstacles and driven away those who might have stood by his side. Memories of betrayal and regret welled up once more. Elena's death had been orchestrated by a rival territory, her loss exploited as the spark to provoke Perdium into war. That conflict eventually drove their household to ruin. Her tragic demise was the catalyst for it all. Determined to alter the course of his family's fate, Ghislain resolved to set everything right in this lifetime. To succeed, he knew he had to strengthen his body and refine his abilities. Time was short, but Ghislain carried confidence in his mastery of mana. Sitting cross-legged in quiet meditation, he closed his eyes and focused. Mana, the mysterious force that allowed humans to surpass their natural limits, was notoriously difficult to sense and control. For Ghislain, however, it came naturally. Even amid chaos, he could attune himself to the particles in the air, drawing them together as if weaving fine threads onto a spool. With the battle-hardened knowledge of his past life, forging a mana core felt almost effortless. Yet one core alone would never suffice. His rise as one of the 7 strongest men had come from mastering something far greater, an advanced technique discovered in a half-burnt magic tome. By expanding the process, he could form not just one, but multiple cores, creating a linked network capable of generating devastating power. As he forced mana through his veins, his body trembled with pain. A scream tore from his throat, and blood spilled from his nose and mouth. Despite his efforts, he managed only 3 cores. The realization left him shaken. In his previous life, he had succeeded in forging 5. The method was formidable but came with crippling demands, draining his mana reserves faster than his body could endure. It had been this very weakness that Aiden had exploited, bringing an entire night order to overwhelm him when his strength faltered. Ghislain remained certain that, had the battle been fought fairly, the outcome would have been different. Though his progress fell short of what he once achieved, Ghislain did not despair. He was younger now, with time and determination on his side. He vowed to refine the technique further, his heart burning with fury. He swore vengeance upon Aiden and the treacherous allies of House Deline who had conspired to destroy Perdium. This time, he would not fall. This time, he would be the one to strike the final blow. The scene shifted to the day of the festival. Dressed in formal gear, Ghislain stepped into the bustling grounds. His presence immediately caught Elena's eye, and her shock was evident. She hurried to him, asking why he had come, reminding him that he had never shown interest in such gatherings before. Ghislain answered calmly, explaining that as a member of Perdium's household, it was his duty to attend from time to time. Elena studied him suspiciously. She noted that he had been acting strangely as of late and mentioned the rumors she had heard about his week-long training regimen, something entirely unlike his former indolent self. Ghislain, wearing a strained expression, insisted that there was nothing unusual about the heir of a knightly family taking his training seriously. She reminded him that he had once dismissed such responsibilities, even calling their father insufferable, while boasting that he could not wait to claim the title of lord. The words struck Ghislain, leaving him stunned to hear his past sentiments thrown back at him. Elena, however, only smiled warmly. She confessed that she liked the changes she saw in him, saying it felt as though the brother she once knew had returned. Her words weighed heavily on Ghislain. Reflecting on the past week, he realized his actions were already reshaping both his reputation and the trajectory of his future. While lost in thought, his gaze drifted to Belinda, who was quietly instructing Elena's guards. She ordered them to handle any trouble caused by Ghislain discreetly, emphasizing that no problems should arise during a festival filled with guests. The men assured her they understood. Despite events unfolding much as they had before, Ghislain struggled to gauge the subtle differences created by his intervention. Every detail mattered, and he reminded himself of the importance of responding to each shift with precision. With that resolve, he remained by Elena's side throughout the festival, all the while keeping a careful watch for the faintest sign of danger. After some time, Elena sat down, admitting she had enjoyed the festival to a degree, though she found it repetitive and wondered if anything new had been introduced this year. Ghislain remarked that it was unusual nothing unfortunate had occurred, speculating that perhaps his presence had deterred trouble. As they reflected, a soldier approached Elena and suggested visiting other areas where fresh events were supposedly taking place. He explained that a friend had mentioned these happenings and invited Elena to accompany him. Surprised, Elena grasped the soldier's hand with excitement, thrilled by the idea of something different to experience. While watching them, Ghislain's expression darkened. He realized, with growing disbelief, that the 2 soldiers accompanying them, Jamal and Philip, were traitors. These men had once been among the most trusted knights of their household, protectors of Elena since childhood, men who had been celebrated for their loyalty and willingness to sacrifice themselves for her. To see them betray her now was nearly incomprehensible. Jamal smiled as he welcomed Elena to the supposed event, leading her into a desolate, neglected part of town. Elena looked around in surprise, questioning whether an event could really be held in such a place. Jamal hesitated before replying nervously that preparations must have been delayed, and that attendees would arrive soon. Elena laughed lightly, assuming he was joking, and teased him about performing in such a rundown spot. Meanwhile, Ghislain carefully studied their surroundings. The blocked escape routes and unnatural quiet revealed deliberate preparation. Elena, tugging at his arm, suggested they leave. Jamal quickly urged her to stay, insisting a performance was about to begin, but Elena shook her head, stating she had no interest in remaining there. Ghislain, masking his suspicion, asked his sister if she had been working out, joking about her strength. Before she could answer, Philip stepped forward with a menacing look, asking Elena to wait. Alarm spread across her face as she accused the two men of behaving strangely, demanding to know if something was wrong. Jamal offered a false apology, but his unsettling tone made her tense further. He mentioned a request that had been received. At that moment, 3 men entered. 2 were clad in black, while their leader wore a blue coat and a matching hat. The leader, Frank, commended the traders for their efficiency. Jamal proudly announced that they had delivered their mistress as promised and declared that their deal was fulfilled. Frank's eyes narrowed when he noticed Ghislain. Dissatisfied, he remarked that he had never asked for the boy to be brought along. Elena instinctively clutched her brother's arm, holding on tightly as Jamal sneered, mocking Ghislain for following them so blindly into what he called his own graveyard. Ghislain's voice was steady as he asked Jamal if he truly believed he could escape after betraying them. Jamal smirked, brushing off the question. He claimed that he and his ally could simply flee to distant lands, far from this impoverished county plagued by barbarian raids. He insisted that others had already abandoned the land, and they would do the same. Before Jamal could finish, Ghislain closed the distance and, with a single strike, cleaved through his armor. Jamal's body collapsed to the ground, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Ghislain's cold voice cut through the air. Those who had left before never attempted to sell out their own people. He turned to Philip and demanded to know if he was wrong. Philip's face twisted in disbelief as he cursed Jamal, calling him a fool. He scoffed at the idea that a knight could fall to an amateur. Before Philip could draw his blade, Ghislain hurled his sword with precision, striking Philip squarely in the forehead. He crumpled lifelessly to the ground. Elena rushed to her brother's side, shaken and confused. One of the men in black, still stunned, asked Frank if the young man before them could truly be Ghislain. Another muttered that he had no prior combat experience or formal training. Frank confirmed their suspicions, though even he admitted the sight was difficult to believe. The speed and power with which Ghislain had slain 2 knights, using strikes infused with mana, was astonishing. Trembling, Elena demanded an explanation from her brother. Ghislain gave no answer. Instead, he swiftly struck her neck, rendering her unconscious. As she collapsed, he caught her gently and laid her on the ground, whispering for her to rest a while. Frank, watching with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, thanked Ghislain for simplifying their work. He noted that Ghislain was far more capable than expected and revealed that they had already planned to deal with Jamal and Philip themselves. Taking a slow puff from his pipe, Frank asked whether Ghislain had been hiding his true strength all along. Ghislain pulled his sword free from Philip's head and, in a measured voice, asked why Frank was so interested in his abilities. As his eyes swept over the group, he dismissed the men in black as little more than minor distractions. Frank, however, was different. The sheer intensity of his mana placed him in an entirely different league. Realizing the danger, Ghislain decided to end the fight swiftly. He released his mana, preparing a set of strings, and demanded to know who had issued the order against him. Frank only sneered, mocking him with the claim that it was pointless for a dead man to learn such details. Accepting that no answers would come willingly, Ghislain tightened his grip, declaring that the truth would eventually be revealed regardless. One of Frank's subordinates asked if they should simply decapitate Ghislain. Frank ordered otherwise. He wanted him captured alive, every bone broken until his mind shattered. With a sinister grin, He added that Gislin's screams of agony would make the perfect masterpiece. At his command, 2 men rushed forward. Gislin slipped a firecracker from his pocket and hurled it at one of the attackers. The sudden blast made the man falter. In that instant, Gislin closed the distance and drove his blade straight through the man's skull. The second subordinate scoffed, calling it a cheap trick, before launching an attack of his own. Gislin spun his sword behind him, intercepting the blow. Their weapons clashed, but Gislin pressed his grip tighter, sliding the blade upward to slice into the man's hand. Before his opponent could recover, Gislin struck again, severing his head with ruthless precision. Frank wasted no time, launching his own sudden attack. Gislin deflected it with a second blade. Shock flickered across Frank's face. He couldn't comprehend how Gislin had managed to block from such an impossible position. Certain that his ambush had been flawless, Frank was caught completely off guard. Gislin shoved Frank's sword downward, rose swiftly, and slashed clean across his neck, sending his pipe clattering to the ground. Yet to Gislin's surprise, Frank retaliated almost instantly, reinforcing his neck with mana. With a cold admission, Frank confessed that if not for his focused concentration, the strike would have taken his life. Gislin quickly realized Frank had redirected his mana at the last possible moment to minimize the damage. Frank steadied himself, adopting a combat stance. He questioned the origin of Gislin's unorthodox swordsmanship, and, with a sinister smile, promised that this battle would be his last. Shoving Gislin back, Frank mocked his seemingly meager mana, confidently declaring that victory was inevitable. But Gislin only smiled in return. That unsettling expression made Frank falter. In that brief hesitation, Gislin parried his blade, disrupting his balance, and followed with a swift kick to Frank's face. Blood dripped from Frank's lip as he smirked, insisting that such strikes were useless against his reinforced mana. A moment later, he doubled over, coughing violently before collapsing to his knees. Confusion clouded his face. He couldn't comprehend how Gislin's meager-seeming mana had managed to bypass his defenses. As Gislin advanced, his eyes hardened. He revealed that he had long suspected someone of orchestrating his sister's death, though he never imagined Frank was the true culprit. With a piercing gaze, he unleashed the full power of his third core, his mana surging to overwhelming levels. Frank's composure shattered. Before he could react, Gislin appeared directly before him, moving faster than his eyes could track. Strike after strike followed, each heavier than the last. Frank's arms trembled under the relentless assault, his weapon on the verge of breaking. Desperate, he reminded himself that mana bursts usually faded quickly, but this was different. Gislin seemed transformed, a force entirely beyond his understanding. With one decisive blow, Gislin shattered Frank's sword and drove his blade deep into his torso. Frank howled in pain, but his cry was silenced as Gislin seized him by the throat and pinned him against the wall, the sword still embedded in his body. Demanding answers, Gislin insisted that Frank reveal who had ordered the assassination. But Frank, defiant to the end, pulled out a concealed blade and swore he would drag Elena down with him. Before he could strike, strings coiled tightly around his wrist, stopping him cold. With steady control over the strings, Gislin warned him against foolish choices. His gaze was cold and unyielding as he offered Frank a final chance: comply and resist no further, or face the inevitable. Frank froze in disbelief as he realized the threads restraining him were forged entirely from mana. He could not comprehend how Gislin had managed to craft such a tool without him noticing. With deliberate precision, Gislin thrust his sword deeper into Frank's body, his voice chilling as he remarked that someone of Frank's skill should be capable of mending such wounds. Yet, his words carried a deadly weight. No amount of talent would save Frank once his mana core was shattered. Terror flickered in Frank's eyes as he looked down and saw Gislin's blade glowing ominously. His composure broke, and he screamed as his core began to fracture uncontrollably. Rage and desperation filled his voice as he accused Gislin of madness, warning that the backlash could unleash a catastrophic explosion and obliterate everything around them. Did Ghislain truly intend to drag them both into destruction? Unmoved, Ghislain's cold gaze did not falter. He replied with icy confidence that only incompetence lost control in such moments, and he was no such fool. Frank's heart pounded. He could see it in Ghislain's eyes. The man wasn't bluffing. Realizing his death was inevitable, Frank shrieked and confessed the truth. Count Desmond had orchestrated the assassination. The Count sought a manufactured excuse to ignite war between the Perdium and Dard families. The revelation shocked Ghislain. In his past life, such schemes were always carried out by factions aligned with Duke Deline. To know the Duke was pulling strings once more while staying safely in the shadows filled him with fury. With his patience gone, Ghislain demanded to know if this was why Frank had targeted his sister. Frank gave a grim smile and confirmed it. Without hesitation, Ghislain's blade pierced the assassin's body once more. Coughing blood, Frank gasped, reminding Ghislain of his earlier promise to sheath the sword. Ghislain smirked, asking why a man who had taken so many lives suddenly feared death. Frank's lips curled into twisted laughter, catching Ghislain off guard. He leaned closer, declaring that his death meant nothing. The Dard family's mission was already fulfilled. Perdium was doomed, he sneered, and who would ever believe someone like Ghislain? Snarling, Ghislain seized the assassin's head and slammed it against the wall. His expression darkened as he promised that this time everything would be different. His rebirth was not meaningless. His sword glowed with deadly brilliance as Frank's screams tore through the air. Energy burst from the assassin's body, erupting into the sky like fireworks before his lifeless form collapsed to the ground. Panting heavily, Ghislain surveyed the devastation. His sister lay unconscious but unharmed. Ensuring no one else was nearby, he discarded his weapon and collapsed to his knees, coughing blood. Wiping his mouth, he muttered bitterly that detonating 3 mana cores had once been effortless for him, back in the days when he reigned as the Mercenary King. Forcing himself to stand, he swore he would not fall here. Stumbling into a nearby building, he kicked the door open and discovered 2 corpses. In his past life, there had been 3, including Alinus. But this time, recalling Frank's earlier confession, he recognized one of the dead as a son of the Dagard family. The boy and his escort knight had been slain, their deaths staged to frame Elena as their murderer. Knowing exposure would trigger war, Ghislain silently moved the bodies. He then produced a firecracker, igniting the building in flames to erase all evidence. With the blaze consuming the damning proof, he lifted his sister and walked away, his resolve burning brighter than the fire behind him. He swore his enemies' schemes would never succeed. Unbeknownst to him, a hidden figure watched from the trees. After a long moment, the observer melted into the shadows. The scene shifted to a round table where the spy delivered grim news: the assassination had failed. The council erupted in disbelief. They could not comprehend how Frank and 2 knights had been defeated. Murmurs turned to accusations as they demanded answers from the spy, furious that he had underestimated a mission he claimed would be simple. Nervously, the spy confessed that his failure was the result of Ghislain's interference. The revelation stunned the men gathered at the table. To them, the idea that the so-called useless bastard of the North could achieve anything of importance was unthinkable. One of the members dismissed the explanation outright, branding Ghislain as nothing more than a pitiful excuse and demanding the spy stop using him as a scapegoat. The spy, however, held firm. He insisted that Ghislain was nothing like the reports and rumors had suggested. Recalling how Ghislain had dismantled their forces, he explained that the man seemed entirely different, someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Still, the spy reassured his superiors that their larger plans remained untouched. The elimination of the Dard family was still within reach, and sparking a territorial war would not prove difficult. He pleaded for another chance, promising to make amends for his failure. The council members, however, were not swayed. They silenced him with scorn, berating him for his inability to gather even the simplest intelligence on a single man. His incompetence had stalled their strategy, and his audacity to ask for another opportunity only enraged them further. Their verdict was swift: the spy would be eliminated. Before the order could be carried out, a man seated upon a throne intervened. His voice cut sharply through the tension, calling the entire commotion tiresome. He commanded the spy to explain exactly what kind of chance he was asking for. With newfound confidence, the spy declared that he could rid them of Ghislain. The man on the throne pressed him, asking how he intended to do so. The spy revealed his plan: a duel. He already had a candidate in mind. When the council demanded to know who, the spy revealed the name Cain Lois. Renowned for his raw, overwhelming swordsmanship despite his youth, Cain was hailed as the embodiment of sheer strength. The spy argued that no one in the north could stand against him, and arranging the duel would be simple, since Cain happened to be Ghislain's cousin. Fixing the spy with a cold, unwavering gaze, the man on the throne issued a final warning: if he failed again, there would be no second chance. The spy vowed not to disappoint. The scene shifted to the training hall of the Perdium household. Fergus entered the room, announcing that it was time for his master's meal. Before he could say more, something shot toward him. Ghislain, in the middle of training, had wrapped a mana thread around the sword at the entrance and pulled it into his hand. Watching his movements carefully, Ghislain tested the thread's responsiveness, swinging the weapon as he adjusted his control. Fergus approached with caution, apologizing for disturbing the session, and asked how his master had managed to summon the sword so effortlessly. Ghislain revealed the thin strand of energy in his hand, explaining that it was a mana thread technique and art of shaping mana into a string. In his past life, he had relied on it constantly, but in his current state, with his meager reserves, he was forced to implode his core to use the method effectively. His limitations now only allowed him to create a handful of threads at once. Fergus, impressed, admitted he had never witnessed such a skill, despite his own training in mana control. He was baffled by how someone once regarded as unskilled could wield such a refined and advanced technique. Ghislain noticed Fergus lingering and asked if there was something else. Fergus lowered his head, thanking Ghislain sincerely for protecting his younger sister. Ghislain, taken aback by the gesture, responded that he had merely done what needed to be done and invited Fergus to share a meal with him. A day later, as expected, the festival was temporarily suspended after the scandal involving a knight's attempt to traffic the young lady. Within the castle walls, Elena voiced her frustration to her brother, upset that no one believed her when she insisted he had saved her. She urged Ghislain to come forward and confirm the truth. But Ghislain only shook his head, assuring her it was unnecessary. Even if he did speak, he explained, no one would believe him either. Belinda, who overheard the conversation, bristled with irritation. She scoffed in disgust at Jamal and Philip, declaring that she had long suspected the two knights of being depraved. To her, their attempt to take Elena for their own gain came as no surprise at all. Ghislain found solace in knowing that his sister had survived the ordeal. He had successfully averted a war, but deep down, he understood their enemies would not relent so easily. The weight of this realization pushed him toward a difficult conclusion: he could not face these challenges alone forever. A military force of his own was the only way forward. As he mulled over his next steps, a maid entered quietly, pushing a cart with a modest meal. She set a plate before him, and when Ghislain lifted the cover, all he found was a single slice of bread. Confused, he turned to Belinda and asked when dessert would be served. The maid, stunned by his question, asked if he truly had no awareness of their circumstances. Before Ghislain could respond, the sound of shouting echoed from beyond the castle walls. He froze for a moment, startled by the uproar. At the gates, a bearded man of stout build was loudly demanding compensation from the Perdium household, furious over the festival's sudden cancellation. Others had gathered with him, pitchforks raised, voices rising in anger. They accused Ghislain and Elena of squandering the county's money and demanded they appear. Guards struggled to keep the crowd calm. Peering through the window, Ghislain tried to make sense of the unrest. Belinda, standing beside him, explained the situation. The county's economy relied heavily on merchants who prospered during the annual festival. While last year's event had been lucrative, this year's abrupt cancellation left many of them in financial ruin. Their anger, she said, was justified. The revelation shocked Ghislain. He had not realized how fragile the county's finances were. Understanding the danger if the merchant's frustration spiraled further, he resolved to intervene. Turning to Fergus, he asked about the soldiers and ordered them to disperse the crowd. But Fergus gave a grim reply there were no soldiers available. Ghislain stared at him in disbelief. Fergus explained that nearly all their forces had been dispatched to the monster-infested forest to repair the damage caused by a recent orc raid. Frustration lined Ghislain's face as the grim reality sank in. Perdium was trapped in an endless struggle, pressed by barbarian raids to the north and monsters prowling the forest on the other side. Governing such a region felt nearly impossible, and the need for swift, decisive action weighed heavily on him. With no money and no soldiers, the truth became unbearable. Pulling Belinda aside, Ghislain reminded her that she was responsible for his finances. He ordered her to use whatever funds remained to appease the merchants. To his dismay, Belinda informed him that there was nothing left. Shocked, Ghislain demanded to know how this had happened. Calmly, she reminded him that his allowance had been cut off by the Count due to his reckless spending in the past. Reeling from the realization that he was broke, Ghislain desperately asked Belinda to lend him some money, but she, too, had none. He turned back to the window, staring at the town below. His thoughts raced. How had his family fallen into such a precarious state? Without money, even his knowledge of the future seemed useless. He wondered if anything within the estate could turn their fortunes around. Before he could dwell further, Ricardo burst into the room, gasping for breath. Startled, Ghislain demanded to know why he was in such a hurry. Ricardo, visibly shaken, informed him that there was a problem. Kane wanted to see him. The name alone shocked Ghislain. The scene shifted to Scoven, who was barely able to stand. His face was battered, and his opponent struck him with a crushing blow that split his chest plate, sending him crashing to the ground. At the tavern entrance, Ghislain arrived just in time to witness his commander collapse. Scoven, spotting his young master, called out weakly. Ghislain, more irritated than moved, turned his gaze toward Kane. Kane Lowes stood before him, a towering young man with a wide, confident smile. He was the heir to Lowes County, Ghislain's cousin, long remembered as both friend and rival.